The Death Corps will sacrifice everything for Vraks. What is precious to others is nothing to us. We will gladly lay down our lives in the name of the Emperor. Colonel Hamor, 261st Krieg Siege Regiment. The Eye of Terror is located in the Segmentum Obscurus. It is a cursed region of the galaxy where the laws of reality do not apply, where the chaos taint seeps into the fabric of the universe, creating a realm of unspeakable nightmare. In the star systems within the Eye, surrounded by the most powerful and unpredictable warp storms, there exist demon worlds, planets wholly devoted to the gods of chaos, planets of madness and insanity where no mortal can keep their mind and soul pure. The Eye is a colossal cancerous growth in the body of the galaxy, a rupture in the material universe through which the warp flows. Slowly but irresistibly it expands, presenting an ever-growing threat to the Imperium and all other spacefaring races. Followers of the Chaos Gods residing there continually attack the realm of humanity in attempts to weaken it. The oldest and most relentless enemies of the Imperium are the Traitor Legions, exiled for their treachery during the Horus Heresy. 9 legions of Space Marines fought on the side of Warmaster Horus, who, after their defeat, sought refuge in the Eye of Terror, from where they continued their war against the Imperium and its false Emperor. And worse still, they are not alone in this. Many inhabitants of the Imperium turn to the worship of the Chaos Gods, some voluntarily, others against their will. Why? Because the human heart has always been weak. In the pursuit of power, wealth and influence, it is not difficult to corrupt it. To those willing to sell their soul and surrender to chaos, the dark powers offer a quick and easy path to real power. To the weak and confused, or those chasing false and phantom ideals like justice or freedom, the Chaos Gods offer aid in their struggle against a cruel and indifferent galaxy, where each person is but one among uncountable millions. Of course, this is nothing more than bait, a lie spread by those who wish to supplant worship of the Divine Emperor with faith in their own gods, thereby advancing the triumph of chaos. Few humans know the true power or ultimate purpose of chaos. The truth is known only to the Lord Inquisitors of the Ordo Malleus and the Seers of the Eldar. And it is that they fight not for the survival of their race, but for the existence of reality itself. Lord Xaphan, apostate cardinal, arch-heretic and despot of Vraks. Brief summary. Vraks Prime. Segmentum Obscurus, Sector Scarus, Subsector Kerak System Vraks, 4 planets, Prime, Secundus, Tertius and Urix. 1 inhabited, Vraks Prime. Vraks has served as an administratum complex for as far back as the records of the Imperial Archives reach into the depths of the centuries. Situated in the Segmentum Obscurus to the galactic northwest of the Eye of Terror, Vraks is primarily significant for its strategic position as part of the Imperium's defensive line against attacks from the forces of chaos. Vraks is one of the many fortress worlds scattered throughout the Segmentum, which are used to store weapons and ammunition that will be required by the Imperial Guard in the event of a full-scale invasion from the Eye of Terror. The Forge Worlds of the Imperium produce an enormous quantity of goods which are then delivered to Fortress Worlds and placed in storage until needed by the officials from the Departmentum Unitorum. It is then dispatched from the warehouse and sent to the required war zone or Imperial Guard regiment. Thanks to its location, Vraks can quickly supply the Guard forces defending the worlds neighbouring the Eye of Terror, particularly the Scarus sector. Thus, it serves as a vital link in the Imperium's defence against major chaos invasions, such as the Black Crusades. The Vraks star system itself was discovered and recorded by the forces of the nascent Imperium, who had departed from Terra after the close of the Age of Strife. Later, it was studied by an expedition under the command of rogue trader Van Meer of the Van Meer's lineage. He also established a supply base to store provisions needed for future expeditions along the edge of the Eye of Terror. As the base grew, its supplies increasingly required protection, which laid the groundwork for Vraks's transformation into a fortress world. A fortress was erected for safeguarding resources from pirates and Xenos. Later, to facilitate access to shuttles and transport ships, a spaceport was constructed. Over time, both became ever larger. to store weapons, ammunition, fuel, uniforms, and other supplies flooding onto the planet like a mighty river. Enormous underground bunkers and hangars were created. Consequently, the defences had to be strengthened as well. The more goods were stored on the planet, the greater the risk of an assault, and thus the defence was further fortified. Over millennia, Vraks turned into a gigantic arsenal. The spaceport expanded to the extent that it could accommodate even the largest shuttles, capable of transferring vast amounts of weaponry, equipment and ammunition to transporters waiting above the planet. Departamento Munitorum officials from their headquarters in the Citadel control all movements of goods to and from Vraks. It also houses the Basilica of St. Leonis, erected by the Cardinal Astra of Vraks in the 38th millennium for the millions of indentured labourers. It holds the relics of St. Leonis, a missionary from the 38th millennium who met a martyr's death at the hands of heretics in the Scarus sector. Thousands of pilgrims and prisoners constantly arrive on Vraks, received by numerous clergy from the Basilica of St. Leonis and the Cardinal's own palace. The Citadel, located at the centre of the Van Meersland wastes, is an enormous fortress constructed atop a long-dead volcano. The base within contains a PDF station, the office of the Master of the Administratum, extensive archives, the Basilica of St. Leonis, the Cardinal's Palace, and the barracks of the Citadel's own garrison. The secure dungeons hewn in the rock beneath the Citadel itself are occasionally used as a special prison for prisoners of the Inquisition, captured across the sector. Here are also located an astropathic station, a precinct of the Adeptus Arbites, and the command centre for the defence laser batteries. The Citadel is the nerve centre of the arsenal, hence its own defence is constantly enhanced. Now, in the opinion of the Departamento Munitorum, Vraks is considered an impregnable fortress. The walls of the Citadel are protected from orbital bombardment by powerful void shields. An extensive curtain wall guards it from ground attacks. It is surrounded by a whole network of defensive laser batteries, which render attacks from space suicidal for practically any ship. These can also be deployed against ground targets, and all approaches to the fortress have long been and reliably ranged. In the wastelands around the Citadel, 3 defensive rings stretch for many miles, protecting the storage bunkers from raiders and including trenches, fire bases, bunkers and fortifications, as well as pre-prepared artillery positions. In addition to all this, the land before them is covered with barbed wire, anti-tank hedgehogs and thousands of minefields. Any army invading Vraks will walk into a real trap and will eventually be exterminated. In the event of a full-scale attack, the Citadel is defended by its own garrison, while the local militia, recruited from the workers and having undergone only basic training, is to occupy the outer defence layers. In the past, Vraks has endured many raids, mostly from profit-seeking renegades and pirates as well as several mutinies. However, over 10,000 years, the planet has never fallen. Chapter 1. The Fall of Vraks. The Scarus sector is akin to a peat bog. One spark can turn into a devastating wildfire, and I shall kindle the flames. His Eminence Lord Xaphan, Cardinal Astris of Scarus. The world plunged into silence. The astropathic relay of Vraks, a high spire of the sensorium at the heart of the Citadel, gathering, transmitting, encrypting and redirecting messages from across the Scarus sector, fell silent. Its last transmission was a crumpled message received by the Administratum office on Cadia. Nothing unusual was noticed, as astrotelepathic messages rarely reached their destination without interference. Psycraft was not among the exact sciences, and initially the small anomaly was given little attention. Only many months later did word of the catastrophe that had befallen his arsenal world reach the master of the Departamento Munitorum. In the corridors of power of Segmentum Obscurus, suspicion began to arise only when even routine messages received no response. The truth shall only be revealed once a thorough investigation and complete analysis of the situation have been undertaken, and the distorted message has been forwarded to the very master of the Departamento Munitorum on Terra. Vraks has fallen. The unassailable fortress and critical storehouses were in the hands of the renegades. How could such a catastrophe occur? The ascension of Cardinal Xaphan. In the year 804 of the 41st millennium, The Cardinal Astro Borja passed away. He was a man of great age, truly ancient by the standards of mere mortals. His life had been sustained for the past 4 centuries by the sorcerous arts of the Adeptus Mechanicus biologists, with daily blood transfusions and the use of rare and costly drugs. Yet even weakened, he laboured for the benefit of the Imperium until his last breath, and his entire diocese mourned his departure. Bells tolled mournfully in all the churches of the subsectors under the Cardinal's rule, even though he had not left the palace of the Ecclesiarchy on the cardinal world of San Arturus for the last 2 centuries. Borja's seat in the Holy Synod became vacant, and a suitable replacement for the deceased was required. It fell to Cardinal Xaphan, a protege of Borja, whose ascent through the ranks of the Adeptus Ministorum was aided by the patronage of a powerful benefactor. Xaphan was elevated to the rank of Cardinal Astro of Scaurus on San Arturus, yet before officially assuming his duties, he decided to embark on a pilgrimage. Xaphan intended to undertake a grand tour of his diocese, as he had never seen his new territories, which included visits to numerous shrines and cathedrals of the Scaurus sector. At each location he intended to preach the imperial creed and ensure the safety of the souls of billions of parishioners. The pilgrimage would take 5 years, and Xaphan would be accompanied on his journey by his retinue, 1,000 preachers, deacons, castellans, servants and lackeys, along with his personal guard from the Adepta Sororitas. These warrior women were a gift from the abbess of the priory on Arturus, from the Order of the Silver Veil in honour of Xaphan's elevation. The galaxy was full of dangers beyond the Arturus system, and the cardinal was obliged to be able to protect himself and his flock through the power of faith and the might of arms. The lengthy pilgrimage led Xaphan to many planets, where his very presence as the Emperor's chosen representative cast the populations into a religious fervour. Fanatical cults, like the Redemptionists, joined the cardinal's retinue. To them, the pilgrimage was seen as a crusade to purify the sector of infidels and heretics. The emperor had sent Xaphan to fulfill a holy mission, and who else but he should the faithful follow? On Thracian Primaris, the cardinal's sermons attracted tens of thousands of parishioners who caused unrest out of a desire just to catch a glimpse of Xaphan. As a result of the efforts of the Sisters of Battle and arbiters in restoring order, hundreds died, though thousands swore personal allegiance to the cardinal. From world to world, the retinue swelled to the size of a small army. The arrival of Xaphan was like a spark that ignited the flame of faith throughout the Scaurus sector. Some extremists even named him the Messiah. Amidst all this fanatical devotion, Cardinal Xaphan, perhaps for the first time, realized the true power granted by his rank. On San Arturus there was undoubtedly much urgent work awaiting, yet here and now, among his flock, he was worshipped. The words of his eminence could marshal armies. Undoubtedly here he could better labour in the Emperor's glory. In the cardinal world he would spend hours debating with the council, signing declarations, and attending meetings with representatives of the administratum. In his own diocese, Xaphan was on the forefront of the real struggle against doubters and heretics, threatening the divine rule of the emperor. The cardinal shared his thoughts with his advisers, particularly with Deacon Mammon, a young man recently joined to His Eminence's retinue on Thracian Primaris. Valued by the cardinal as a man of action, and one who understood local peculiarities, the deacon supported the ideas already sprouting in Xaphan's mind. With a leader uniting such a vast array of imperial cults, the cardinal's pilgrimage had the chance to escalate into a war of faith encompassing the entire sector. However, Mammon advised Xaphan to act very cautiously. The Inquisition had cast its spy networks widely, and the Cardinal Estrate's actions would not escape the attention of the infamous Ordo Hereticus. One wrong move, and Xaphan would be arrested for violating the Ecclesiarchy's strict laws. The primary danger was the ancient prohibition against clergy leading troops, established during the Age of Apostasy, when Cardinal Van Dyer raised a rebellion and almost destroyed the Imperium with his reign of blood. Most likely, among Xaphan's retinue were already traitors and informants. These weak-willed individuals lacked the cardinal's clear vision and understanding of his sacred plan. The spies were in the service of the Ordo Hereticus and were a hindrance to the impending holy war. With Mammon's prompting, Xaphan stopped trusting those around him completely. The cardinal required an inner circle of close advisors, reliable comrades who would be closely monitored to ensure their loyalty. If the religious war were destined to begin, Xaphan needed a safe and well-protected planet to prepare his plan for further actions. Deacon Mammon's choice fell on Vraks. This planet was an arsenal world of the Departamento Munitorum, a gigantic warehouse of military production, and also the site of the Basilica of St. Leonis. He was a missionary who embraced martyrdom through blinding in the 38th millennium during the spread of the Emperor's word among the wild star systems of the Scarus sector. The temple was erected to house the relics and remains of the saint. In his pilgrimage, His Eminence would be required to visit the basilica and take residence in the palace adjacent to the temple. The latter already belonged to Xaphan as part of the estates granted to him along with his rank. It was maintained by a small staff on the off chance that the cardinal might ever wish to visit his holdings. However, the palace also served as an Adeptus Ministorum administrative centre, overseeing the pilgrims who arrived to visit the temple. The cardinal delegated all the preparation details to his favoured deacon, who was required to obtain permission to visit Vraks. The star system itself was within a heavily guarded area, and special clearance was required for ships to access it. It was necessary to notify the Departamento Munitorum of the cardinal's arrival with his entourage, and the Imperial Navy was ordered to provide a vessel for the transportation of Xaphan and an honour guard. All these actions were undertaken through official channels. After coordinating security arrangements, the Basilica Palace staff delved into feverish preparations for the arrival of His Eminence as soon as the astropathic communication was received with the official notification of the Cardinal Astra's intent to establish his residence on Vraks within the month. The World Forge was destined to become the seat of Xaphan's power in the Scarus sector until the commencement of the Holy War or the continuation of his pilgrimage. The Cardinal on Vraks. The arrival of the Cardinal Astra on Vraks became a grand event, culminating in a procession led by Xaphan in ceremonial attire with his retinue, aiming to visit the relics of St. Leonis. Thousands of fanatical pilgrims trailed closely behind. The cardinal marched to the citadel along a road lined with local garrison soldiers in parade formation saluting him. Having given his blessing to the servants of the emperor, he held meetings with the garrison commander and the magister prefect of the Departamento Munitorum, who managed the planet's armory depots. After this, Xaphan withdrew to his palace in the company of his closest advisors. Few saw the cardinal after these initial meetings. He did not appear in public, secluding himself within the palace and granting audiences to only a select few. The life and work of the Departamento Munitorum returned to normalcy. Pilgrims continued to arrive to visit the Temple of St. Leonis, and labourers crushed and moved stones. Sisters of battle from the Order of the Argent Shroud settled in a small priory by the basilica, forming an honour guard at the relics and remains of the saint. There was no cause for suspicion, yet in the very heart of Vraks, betrayal and treachery nestled. Together with Deacon Mammon, His Eminence set out to draft plans for the first steps of the impending religious war. Undoubtedly, he required a formidable army, and though he already possessed a core of faithful followers, it was clearly insufficient. To overcome the problem, the deacon found a way to bypass the ancient prohibition on representatives of the ecclesiarchy commanding armies. The cardinal could not possess an army of his own, yet under the looming threat, the Basilica of St. Leonis could field the Frateris militia for self-defence from among the monastery's brethren. Thus, the deacons, preachers and missionaries began spreading the word to pilgrims and workers that Vraks was in danger. Rumours were rife that the forces of heretics had already invaded neighbouring systems and the arsenal world was obligated to defend itself. The preachers recruited monks and pilgrims by the thousands into the ranks of the Frateris militia, and soon a small army assembled within the basilica's walls. The population of Vraks was engulfed in religious fanaticism. Anyone criticising His Eminence was demonized, with some even arrested and thrown into prison. To the masses, Xaphan was a messiah, the planet's defender, destined to save his flock from the heretical forces threatening Vraks. Simultaneously, Mammon engaged in creating an inner circle of ardently devoted adherents of the cardinal. The preachers were ordered to recruit monks, pilgrims, and other pious individuals who vowed loyalty to his eminence. This group was dubbed the followers of Xaphan, comprising the cardinal's most fervent supporters on whom he could rely, ready to fight for their master to the last drop of blood. The inner circle also ensnared commanders from Vraks's garrisons, the citadel's steward and high-ranking militia command. Mammon considered the loyalty of these individuals a critical factor, and through the cardinal's immense wealth he acquired it. Where bribery failed to yield results, the deacon, leveraging his eminence's colossal influence, displaced individuals from their positions, promoting those more pliable. No army under these men's command was directly subordinate to Xaphan, so technically the ancient prohibition was not violated. However, this did not prevent the commanders from obediently dancing to the cardinal's tune. The militias had their purpose, but could not replace well-trained and equipped regular troops. Over time, the cardinal effectively seized control of virtually all the planet's military forces, with the exception of Adeptus Arbite's detachments that remained beyond his influence. The assassination attempt on Xaphan. While His Eminence concealed his true intentions, his teachings spread among the oppressed and desperate work gangs of Vraks like a wildfire. These condemned souls endured a miserable existence on the construction sites of underground vaults, defensive structures, and transport networks for the Departamento Munitorum. Millions of conscripted labourers were recorded on the planet, dressed in worn and tattered overalls, shackled together and constantly under guard surveillance. Xaphan's preachers spread a message that offered these wretched individuals a small glimmer of hope. The cardinal would forgive transgressions and crimes for any who joined the forthcoming crusade. For many, this was a chance to escape their brutal and short-lived current existence. And this chance became the spark that ignited the flame of rebellion. The cardinal's words were heard by others too. Deacon Mammon was correct. The Inquisition had many informants, and soon the news of His Eminence's sermons alarmed the Ordo Hereticus. Their sacred duty was to root out heresy within the imperial cult and track enemy influence on the various departments of the Imperium. The Inquisitors had seen this before, power-drunk cardinals turning away from the light of the Emperor, believing they should be worshipped alongside the Master of Mankind. Urgent decisive action was necessary, and a covert order was given to terminate the brief rule of His Eminence Xaphan. A sniper assassin had awaited the opportune moment for many days. Under the cover of darkness, he infiltrated the citadel disguised as a pilgrim. Avoiding the guards, he climbed to the highest tower of the basilica, from where he had a view of almost the entire palace. There, on a narrow ledge, under the protection of his camouflaging suit, the assassin patiently waited for the right moment, diligently observing the cardinal's palace, the movements of the guards, arriving guests and departing officials to deliver the fatal strike. Finally, the shot rang out. A powerful, penetrating round pierced a decorative column and struck the cardinal. In a bright burst of energy, His Eminence was thrown backward, but the refractor field generator woven into his rosarius saved Xaphan's life. The bodyguards rushed to their master, and two were immediately killed by precise headshots. Blood sprayed across the mosaic floor of the basilica, but the sniper's sole chance was missed. The assassin quickly reloaded the rifle and leaped into the narrow shaft through which he had reached the ledge. Inside the ancient tower it was dark and dusty. His mask compensated for the lack of light, and the assassin made his way to the narrow spiral staircase. Fortunately, he had long since formulated and memorized an escape plan. Suddenly, the inner courtyard of the citadel was flooded with panicking pilgrims and running guards. The sniper emerged from the door and stumbled upon an aspiring preacher, frozen at the sight of the sleek, black figure. This was the last thing he saw in his life, for a shot from the Exitus rifle, fired from the hip, pierced his chest. The assassin started running, but the chase had already begun. Bodyguards rushed to block all exits from the palace and the basilica. The sniper slipped through a side door, shooting off the lock. Stealth was now of no consequence, and all that mattered was a successful escape and the death of anyone who stood in his way. Discarding the rifle for extra speed and drawing a pistol, the assassin dashed down the poorly lit corridor with all the swiftness granted to him. A pair of errant shots, and the two guards pursuing him collapsed into pools of blood on the floor. Taking cover in a side niche and pouring pistol fire down the passage, the sniper noticed that the Cardinal's men appeared from the opposite end of the corridor as well. He began desperately searching for other avenues of retreat. Rolling across the corridor, the assassin spotted a door and with a single blow knocked it off its hinges. Behind it was an old staircase that led down to the crypts of the basilica. Rushing directly into the darkness, the sniper found himself at a dead end. Here stood ancient sarcophagi of holy people, as well as the remains of numerous pilgrims who had visited Vraks in past centuries. The first bodyguards to enter the crypt were the first to die from precise shots. But now they had cornered the assassin. He had nowhere to run. Grenades flew into the crypt, filling the room with dust and smoke. Several more grenades followed, after which Xaphan's men stormed inside, firing from all barrels. With his last pair of bullets, the sniper took down 2 more guards, only to be ruthlessly riddled with bullets himself. The assassin's body was pulled out for all to see and paraded before the faithful. He was a traitor who had tried to kill His Eminence. Rebellion. The forces of the heretics struck at the cardinal, attempting to kill their messiah, so said Xaphan's preachers. News of the assassination attempt led to rioting at the Vraks spaceport, as pilgrims went mad with fear, believing that enemy forces, as had been foretold, had begun their invasion. The Frateris militia hurriedly armed themselves, and the arsenal guards were ordered not to hinder them. Marauders were mass looting weapons and equipment. Adeptus Arbites were deployed to restore order, but soon found themselves in the thick of fierce street fighting at the spaceport. They requested support from the Citadel's garrison, but by Deacon Mammon's order, they were refused. After some time, the Arbites' precinct was besieged by an enraged mob and held out for several more weeks before finally succumbing to the pressure. It had begun. The Cardinal commenced the takeover of Vraks and the inception of his crusade. Throughout the 4th habitation zone, skirmishes flared between the worker brigades and their guards. Other prisoners followed the example of their comrades and soon joined in the plundering of the arsenals. The guards fled in terror from the maddened crowds. Still loyal to the Magister Prefect of Vraks, some individuals attempted to issue orders for the organization of a militia to oppose the rebels, yet these decisions were swiftly countermanded by a counter-order from the officers of the Cardinal. In the ensuing days, absolute chaos reigned, and it seemed as if civil war had erupted on Vraks. Bloody battles occurred everywhere between the factions, often without fully understanding why they were fighting each other. The prioress of the Order of the Silver Shroud demanded an immediate audience with His Eminence. Undoubtedly, the mobilization of the Sisters of Battle was necessary to restore order, or at the very least to come to the aid of the arbitrators besieged in the spaceport area. Instead, the followers of Xaphan arrested the prioress and threw her into the prison dungeons of Vraks. Following the arrest, the Cardinal's men went to the priory and detained the remaining Sisters of Battle. Some put up resistance, yet the numerical advantage of the enemy and the suddenness of the treacherous attack left the defenders no chance. The captured sororitas were shackled and cast into dungeons. Meanwhile, the prisons emptied, and the former inmates stood before His Eminence, the man who had freed them from their unenviable fate. By order of Archdeacon Mammon, the followers of Xaphan stormed the administratum buildings where the Magister Prefect of Vraks had taken refuge. The latter attempted to flee, but was killed on the way to the shuttle landing pad. Soon, the entire citadel was under the complete control of the Cardinal. The garrison soldiers, following their officers' orders, locked themselves in the barracks. Anyone refusing to swear loyalty to His Eminence was executed by the followers of Xaphan. The Sensorium Tower was also stormed, and the astropaths were slaughtered to the last man. While battles raged across the planet, the Citadel, the seat of power, fell from within, When the last echoes of battle subsided, Cardinal Xaphan remained the sole ruler of Vraks. Chapter 2. The Approaching War. There will be no great victory, no rewards or glory to be won on Vraks. It will all be brutal and merciless. We will make the enemy bleed before we bleed ourselves. Lord Zuelki, Supreme Commander, 88th Siege Army. Response from the Departamento Munitorum. The Departamento Munitorum did not immediately react to the fall of Vraks. The news of the rebellion required much time for confirmation and to reach the organization's officio in segmentum obscurus. Even after confirmation, the officio could not act without notifying the administratum on terra. Months passed in inaction before the bureaucracy at the heart of the Imperium processed the received information. When the message regarding the fate of Vraks gained highest priority, the gears of the administratum slowly began to turn. The loss of an arsenal world was considered utterly unacceptable. Although a small planet with a population of 8 million was insignificant compared to the epic crusades of the tyrannic wars raging at that moment on the eastern fringe, it was Vrax's strategic location in the rear chain of the Departamento that made its loss so painful. Who knew what damage would be done if the Imperial Guard regiments were left without proper supply before the impending battles? Divinations of the Imperial Tarot concerning Vraks foretold nothing but calamity and misfortune. The loss of the Arsenal world significantly weakened the defense of the Imperium around the Eye of Terror. Undoubtedly, the servants of the Dark Gods would not miss the opportunity to strike at the worlds of the Scarus sector. Should their plan succeed, after seizing other planets, even more heretical forces would flock like moths to a flame to join the plundering. Moreover, within 10 years, the loss of Vraks could become the spark from which a new Black Crusade could ignite. The Supreme Magister of the Departamento Munitorum could not take such a risk. The Arsenal world had to be returned under the Emperor's control at all costs. But how? The task of reclaiming Vraks was entrusted to the Supreme Command of the Imperial Guard of Segmentum Obscurus, stationed on Cadia. The Lord Castellan and the Lord Commander of Obscurus were personally present at the council discussing campaign plans. Executing the Order of Holy Terror proved to be extremely challenging. Since Vraks had been specially prepared to resist an invasion, any battle would require colossal efforts. The planet's defensive systems had been continuously improved since ancient times. Vraks was a bastion world, impregnable to frontal assaults. No one had ever succeeded in storming it. Various solutions to the problem were discussed. Some officers even argued that the entire counter-seizure plan was foolish, as the human and material losses during the operation would allow other worlds to fall under the assault of the enemies of the Imperium. In their opinion, Vraks was lost, and the Departamento should only focus on preventing a similar tragedy in the future, rather than planning a hopeless campaign to correct their own errors and judgments. The warehouses of the Arsenal world were lost, so why not write off all the damage and concentrate on increasing production in the segmentum to compensate for the losses? The voices of skeptics did not affect the determination of the Supreme Commander and his staff to start a war. The order came directly from Terra, sealed by the Chancellor-Prefect's seal of the Administratum's Magister. A high-ranking servant of the High Lord of Terra could not be so easily ignored. Hesitation in actions would almost certainly provoke swift retribution from the Inquisition. Did any of those present at the Council prefer to take responsibility for their failure in the torture chambers of the Ordo Hereticus? Even with a slight chance of success, the war for Vraks was destined to commence. The Council's task was to determine the methods of conducting this war. The first proposal was the simplest: a sudden frontal attack. This would include an orbital bombardment by the powerful vessels of the Imperial Navy, and an assault led by the forces of the Adeptus Astartes. Envoys could swiftly contact the Space Marines to secure their assistance. High Command began calculating the resources required for such an operation. Archives were scoured in search of information on Vrax's defensive systems. The assembled dossier turned out to be quite extensive, and during the reading it plunged the assembled into increasing despondency. Even during the period of construction, it was quite obvious that the citadel and the spaceport of the Arsenal world would be vulnerable to orbital assault. The defensive structures were specifically designed to repel such an attack. Laser batteries encircled the main targets, possibly about 100 guns, and this firepower was sufficient to counter an entire fleet in low orbit. Imperial battleships and cruisers were colossal starships, yet no spacecraft can contend with a planet. With deeply entrenched batteries, fleet vessels would find themselves in extremely disadvantageous conditions during battle. To deploy troops, the ships would need to descend to low orbit, where they would become vulnerable while maneuvering into position to launch landing shuttles. The transports themselves would be targeted by the defensive systems, and a single hit from a laser battery would tear a shuttle to shreds, while any that penetrated would enter the kill zone of the medium and short-range air defense network. The conclusions from the Logis calculations indicated that a planetary assault would not be justified and would lead to colossal losses in manpower and materiel, with the number of troops reaching the surface clearly insufficient to capture the citadel. Even the mighty Space Marines would not dare undertake such an operation. No chapter master would risk his battle barge and warriors for the meagre chance of victory. Therefore, support from the Space Marines in the event of approving the planetary assault plans was not to be expected. The swiftest and simplest solution was rejected. However Vraks was to be captured, it would not be done quickly. An alternative long-term strategy was brought up for discussion. Some suggested utilizing the Imperial Navy to establish a blockade, with the aim of isolating the system from incoming reinforcements. Following this for, say, 100 years, raids could be conducted on the planet, deploying small, well-prepared squads to deliver precise strikes against the defenders, and in particular against the orbital defense laser systems, to deplete the defenders battery by battery. Perhaps after a century of isolation and raids, the defensive systems will be so weakened that it will become possible to initiate a planetary assault operation. However, once again the calculations of the Logis failed to inspire hope. This plan could work with an execution period estimated at 500 years. The Departamento Munitorum rejected this idea as inadequate. They had no intention of waiting half a millennium to reclaim a single world. The third thoroughly detailed proposal was to conduct a massive siege operation. A ground army was required, large enough to support a siege over many years and capable of ruthlessly crushing the enemy's defences. If the battle for Vraks could be turned into a war of attrition, then eventually, with significantly superior resources, the Loyalists would prevail. If the Departamento Munitorum were prepared for a losses ratio of attackers to defenders being 2 to 1, how long and how many people would be needed to capture the Arsenal world? The Logis, human cogitators, set about their calculations. Taking into account all factors, replacement ratios, supply requirements, the whims of warp travel, the number of supplies and the enemy's human resources, the answer was given. In 12 standard Terran years from the commencement of the siege, including preparation time, Vraks would return under the control of the Imperium. The results of the study of possible further actions were submitted to the Master of the Departamento Munitorum on Terra. Here it was, the operational solution. Could the Departamento cope with the challenge of supplying manpower and material for such a large-scale operation? The answer was given. Supplies and people would be found. Furthermore, they would form a new army exclusively for the capture of Vraks. It was designated as the 88th Siege Army of the Imperial Guard. 88th Siege Army of the Imperial Guard. All soldiers for the new army would be conscripted from the planet Krieg. This world already had one of the highest quotas for forming Imperial Guard regiments. Only a few planets in the Imperium provided more soldiers for service to the Emperor. In the regiments of Krieg, known as the Death Corps, served grim warriors who had developed specific combat doctrines during the brutal 500-year civil war on their home planet. During this war, the Loyalists attempted to destroy the rebels using nuclear bombardments. The planet perished when mushroom clouds rose skyward across the entire surface of Krieg. To survive in the hellish radiation-poisoned battlefields, the population and the war went underground. Trenches and tunnel labyrinths crisscrossed the entire planet, and the confrontation transitioned to a positional stage. But this meant that for 15 generations, the people of Krieg grew up and trained in the tradition of unending trench warfare and battles of attrition. When it came to these bloody and protracted battles, the Death Corps were unmatched. Unlike other Imperial Guard regiments, a distinctive feature of the Krieg's character was their readiness to sacrifice themselves without a moment's hesitation. They were capable of enduring the nightmarish psychological strain induced by protracted war. In the past, other regiments had broken from the overstrain during extended campaigns and had even risen in mutiny. The Death Corps cannot be broken. They would continue to fight regardless of losses. They simply knew no other way. The overall command of the 88th Siege Army was entrusted to Lord General Zuelka, a son of a noble lineage whose influence extended broadly across the highest echelons of power within the Imperial Navy and the Guard. His great-great-grandfather had once served as an attaché to the Lord Commander Solar on Terra. Unlike his social standing, Lord Zuelka's skills required for the successful conduct of a campaign were few. Only military upbringing and a thorough study of the Tactica Imperialis. However, political pressure and the good name of his family bore fruit. Lord Zuelka appointed a large staff to commence the lengthy process of organizing the army and preparing for the battle for Vraks. The protracted preparations for the siege of the Arsenal world were, in essence, brutally simple. How many guardsmen must perish for the definitive capture of the planet? The planning of attacks on defensive lines, fortified areas, spaceports, defensive batteries, and ultimately the assault on the citadel were reduced to a mathematical formula. Everything in the 88th Siege Army was expendable. How many soldiers to dig a trench, and with how many shovels? How many men would be required to capture 100 meters of territory or a stronghold? How many guns for destroying the enemy trench network? How many tugs, machine gun crews, shells, spare parts, water rations and food portions? The lists were endless. Sheet after sheet was filled with the results of preliminary calculations. Before the first guardsman was assigned to a regiment or the first rifle was manufactured, the 88th Siege Army already existed on the pages of thousands of data slates. It was the most impersonal type of war. In the Death Corps, fighters bore not names but numbers for the convenience of accounting and the swiftness of filling casualty lists. Units were sent into battle already knowing how many were destined to die. Based on thorough calculations by the Logis, the 88th Siege Army could predict with high precision the outcome of any battle. What would be achieved and at what cost? The lives of the Krieg guardsmen were no more important than the magnitude of daily fuel consumption or artillery shells. The formula would determine when and how many soldiers would engage in battle. It also claimed that victory would be attained within 12 standard Terran years. The defenders of Vraks. On Vraks, the sudden rebellion and triumph of the Cardinal turned into a landslide escalation of street violence. Over several months, insurgents fought among themselves to establish a new power structure under His Eminence. From garrisons and labour camps, new leaders emerged. Those who pledged allegiance to the Cardinal's regime were rewarded with high-ranking positions, and those who distinguished themselves the most had the chance to join the ranks of the overseers or even the followers of Xaphan, an elite cadre within His Eminence's forces tasked with ensuring unwavering obedience and discipline regardless of status or position. When the bloodshed and insurrection subsided, the Cardinal's commanders received their first directive to secure Vraks against any potential counteroffensive by the Loyalists. Their task was to create a combat-ready and well-equipped army. The rebels had colossal stockpiles of the Astra Militarum. The insurgents would be well outfitted and entrenched in formidable fortifications, yet they needed to be prepared for whatever the Imperium could unleash upon them. The Cardinal instructed that the planet be transformed into a slaughterhouse for any attacking force. The population was told that they should not expect mercy from the attackers, and their only chance of survival was to fight to the last drop of blood. Only in the enemy's defeat lay their path to salvation. with great rewards and honours awaiting the particularly brave. As for those who shirked their duty to His Eminence, they faced only mass executions at the hands of the overseers. Following the rebellion, the newfound freedom of the rebels proved short-lived. The workers returned to the camps, labouring to enhance the fortifications, laying minefields and stretching miles of barbed wire. Artillery crews practiced precision firing and calibrated their guns. The rebel militia, willingly or otherwise, trained with their newly looted weapons. Xaphan's army was gathering strength, and when the time for the decisive battle came, the enemies would pay a bloody price for attempting invasion. This slaughter would provide the cardinal with satisfaction and ensure his victory. Opposing armies. The army that the Imperium was poised to confront was a formidable foe, at least in terms of sheer size. Although precise data were unavailable, preliminary estimates placed the population of Vraks at around 8 million, all of whom could now be considered traitors and potential manpower for the forces of the heretic cardinal. This army would be composed of units of varying degrees of readiness, from well-drilled, equipped and fanatically loyal soldiers to an undisciplined rabble. The most powerful troops of Vraks were the followers of Xaphan. These elite fighters were personally selected by representatives of the cardinal from among the most loyal participants in the uprising, with some chosen for their considerable martial skills. Each follower swore an oath directly to His Eminence, and in return was granted access to the most valuable equipment. The Imperium did not possess exact data on their number, but assumed that Xaphan's personal troops would form a formidable core within the enemy army. Next were the auxiliary garrisons. Due to its location and strategic importance, a huge contingent of auxiliary troops was stationed on Vraks. For the most part, they were equivalent to the planetary defence forces, forming a second echelon behind the regiments of the Imperial Guard. The garrisons did not possess the training or equipment of regular guardsman units, but access to the captured depots somewhat equalized the odds through large stockpiles of military equipment, Leman Russ, chimeras and basilisks. Whether they could effectively utilize the acquired weaponry remained an open question, but it should be remembered that the core of the garrisons was formed from veterans and officers who had entered service from unrecoverable regiments of the Astra Militarum. However, it could be argued that even well-equipped, these units had little chance of conducting large-scale coordinated operations. Nonetheless, the auxiliary garrisons could serve in bunkers and other static defensive fortifications. The next type of renegade forces consisted of labour brigades. The Departmentum Munitorum maintained numerous labour camps on Vraks, housing a large population of Ogrins. The teams comprised forced labourers performing routine work, such as road construction, ferrocrete bunker repairs, strengthening of defensive structures, blasting for new underground construction sites, and cargo transport at the spaceport. Most were despairing individuals leading a miserable existence amidst brutality and hard labour. Consequently, many joined the forces of the rebellious cardinal voluntarily, viewing the fight for their leader as an opportunity to escape a harsh fate. General discontent with the current Magister Prefect of Departmento Munitorum, who mistreated the workers, also fueled the fire of rebellion. Many who joined the renegades already possessed basic combat skills, as in addition to work, the brigades provided manpower for militia forces. In case of an attack, the garrisons lacked sufficient numbers to fill all defensive positions, a responsibility that fell to the militia. Workers who joined received additional rations, slightly better living conditions, and training days. Although the training was merely superficial, the Vraks militia was a massive force. 1 in 4 workers was either conscripted or voluntarily enlisted into the militia. Without artillery, armoured vehicles and heavy weapons, it served as the third line of defence for the planet. The lack of firepower within the militias could also be compensated for through looted imperial weaponry, and additional training would enable workers to occupy static fortifications. The last part of the rebels' army consisted of itinerant pilgrims with former officials of the Departmentum Munitorum. These were individuals without military experience, yet, like the labour brigades, stolen weaponry from the Imperial Guard commanded a degree of respect. Although many pilgrims regarded the cardinal as their messiah, the majority had no idea why or for what cause they were marching into battle. A significant number volunteered for the Frateris militia, convinced that they were fulfilling a sacred duty to defend the Basilica of St. Leonis from enemy forces. They were informed that the invaders were heretics, and all the faithful should join the defenders to prevent the desecration of the holy site. Even with the volume of weapons acquired, these troops were given the lowest priority in the distribution of equipment. To maintain the pilgrims' morale, Xaphan sent his agents and preachers to spread the teachings of His Eminence and strengthen the fighters' loyalty. Some of the garrison's soldiers, often former sergeants, were promoted to overseers. The task of these individuals was to maintain discipline and order, akin to the commissars of the Imperial Guard. In battle, overseers were to position themselves behind the front line and shoot any soldiers who abandoned their positions. But the greatest concern was posed by the prisoners released from the vaults of Vraks. Madmen and psychopaths joined the ranks of the traitors, not to mention the prisoners displaying psychic abilities. Helpless before the entities of the warp, several hundred such inmates awaited the arrival of the next black ship of the Inquisition for transportation to Terra. The Cardinal treated these unbound psychers as his children, claiming that they conveyed good tidings from the gods to him. Despite such varying levels of preparedness, the defenders of Vraks would have the advantage of access to Imperial Guard equipment and already constructed defensive lines. The task of assaulting such formidable fortifications would fall to regiments summoned from the planet Krieg. The Death Corps were among the finest regiments of the Imperial Guard throughout the Imperium. The warriors of Krieg were devoted, efficient and disciplined beyond measure. They could fight with an almost inhuman disregard for casualties, considering death in battle and self-sacrifice in the Emperor's glory as their highest purpose. Breaking the spirit of the 88th Siege Army was nearly impossible, precisely why they were chosen to participate in the campaign. Equipment for the Death Corps would be provided from Krieg's own arsenals, with types of weaponry varying according to the unit's intended purpose. For this campaign, most regiments would be siege-oriented, planning for prolonged positional warfare with an emphasis on various types of artillery. Indeed, artillery was at the heart of the entire plan to capture Vraks, destined to play the leading role. The guns were the key to success, and concentrations of heavy batteries were intended to obliterate the enemy's fortified positions, thus providing corridors for the infantry's advance. Each regiment was assigned its own artillery company, ranging in composition from small mortars for frontline use to heavy guns and howitzers. The sieging artillery pieces, Medusa and Earthshaker, were the workhorses of the 88th Army, accompanied by the mighty Bombards, the heaviest artillery at the disposal of the Imperial Guard. The task of these colossal weapons was the annihilation of the most fortified enemy defensive lines. To enhance their firepower, commanders of the 88th Army could call upon a great multitude of independent artillery batteries, including regiments of heavy siege artillery. Other units would be equipped as more mobile armoured forces deployed for breakthroughs in enemy lines. As these forces were not intended to remain on the front line for long, the tank's task was to support infantry assaults. Command did not plan to escalate from trench warfare to large-scale tank battles. Nonetheless, Leman Russ, Baneblade and Gorgons would play their part in the assault. The battlefield. For the soldiers of the Death Corps of Krieg, Vraks would become an utterly alien environment. All of them had been raised in the subterranean hive cities of Krieg, where people were accustomed to overcrowding and recycled oxygen. Training sessions were conducted on the cold, contaminated surface of the planet, amidst the eternal nuclear winter and the ruined husks of ancient cities. The landscape was scarred by a near-planet-wide network of trenches and rusting barbed wire, remnants of a civil war. The Death Corps traversed areas of increased radiation and engaged in training battles with other training units. They marched, then dug trench lines. Conditions were nightmarish, and not all survived the full course of training. However, despite its severity, it could not compare to actual combat. Now, the Death Corps was entering the very crucible of battle, many for the first time. And although they bore regimental numbers with long and glorious histories, These were reconstituted regiments with many new recruits in their ranks. Vraks itself was an infertile, rocky and drab planet, covered in a sulfuric blanket of ancient volcanic dust. The climate was warmer than on Krieg, yet electrical storms occurred daily, and sudden downpours ended as swiftly as they began. These natural phenomena turned the terrain into an impassable grey mire until the water soaked into the planet's porous surface. The main combat would unfold on the Van Meersland wastes, 5,000 square kilometres of barren plains, among gentle hills and rare clusters of volcanic rocks not yet eroded by rain. The terrain was almost featureless, but it was territory well known to the enemy. The Departamento Munitorum supplied the Krieg officers with maps, but they bore no noteworthy topographical features. The enemy knew all the elevations, where guns could be positioned most effectively. This intuitive understanding of the battlefield was something the Death Corps had to learn during the campaign itself. Chapter 3: Fields of Death, Vraks. Our credo is simple. We are ready at any moment to sacrifice everything for victory. Colonel Zek, 15th Krieg Siege Regiment. Landing. In the year 812 of the 41st millennium, 200,000 guardsmen of the 143rd Krieg Siege Regiment stepped onto the landing ramps of transport ships, one grey line after another. They were the first soldiers of the 88th Siege Army departing for Vraks. The first, but far from the last. The transports were but a small part of the gigantic armada, preparing to depart for the Arsenal world. Lord High Commander Zwelker had established his headquarters on Thracian Primaris, the principal planet of the Scarus sector. An unstoppable war machine had been set in motion, and the Lord High Commander's personal presence on Vraks was not required. He would oversee the campaign from a distance. Victory was already assured, and it remained only to monitor the regularity of supply deliveries and replenish losses in a timely manner. The first convoy of ships carrying troops, supplies and equipment from Krieg arrived in the Vraks system in the year 812 of the 41st millennium. The vanguard of the 88th Siege Army was stationed in 21 transport ships of various sizes, escorted by vessels of the Imperial Navy under the command of Admiral Rasiak on the flagship cruiser Lord Bellerophon. They charted a course to approach the Arsenal world from a safe side, unguarded by protective laser batteries. The defenders did not possess a fleet capable of opposing the advancing armada, and the landing began with relative safety. The landing zones were chosen to provide the 88th Army with a strong foothold for the preliminary organisation of the arriving regiments and supply depots. The areas had to be secured from potential enemy attacks, so the first arriving guardsmen of the 143rd immediately constructed a basic network of trenches. For this purpose, Atlas excavators, an engineering variant of the tractor with the same name, were used to dig the ground, on which minefields and barbed wire were subsequently installed. Companies of Death Riders were dispatched to patrol the surroundings, but they reported only barren terrain with no signs of enemy presence. The enemy made no attempts to disrupt the landing with primary organisation, instead entrenching themselves further in their positions. For several months, the landing zones resembled a disturbed anthill as landing and cargo ships delivered soldiers, artillery and equipment from orbit. Shuttles operated non-stop, and provisions, drinking water, ammunition, shells and other resources necessary for the Army's normal functioning were stockpiled in massive warehouses for a period of 12 years. This activity was immense and continued until all regiments of the 88th Siege Army arrived on Vraks. About a year was required to complete all preparations. At the same time, the Departamento Munitorum also delivered a large contingent of labour brigades to Vraks, consisting of more than 500,000 individuals. For the most part, these were prisoners from the prison worlds of harpists, tasked with maintaining the military economy. Even when the guardsmen with supplies arrived in the Arsenal world, they still had to travel almost 2,000 kilometres to their first target. It would have been foolish to expect that people, horses and machines could traverse this significant distance and retain full combat effectiveness. Therefore, an alternative transportation system was devised. Work teams commenced laying railway tracks. Tracks were laid day and night, and the transport network rapidly expanded northward. According to schedule, trains filled with guardsmen would rush along them, promptly heading from distant stations directly to the fort line. On board one of the transport vessels arrived a delegation of the Adeptus Mechanicus, and with them came the locomotives, colossal roaring mastodons of steel capable of hauling hundreds of heavy wagons. The tech priests performed their work, and soon the locomotives were on the tracks, ready to deliver the soldiers of the 88th Siege Army right to the enemy's doorstep. As military resource reserves grew, the length of the railway tracks increased. In the year 812 of the 41st millennium, the first train departed from the depot, tirelessly transporting guardsmen and artillery of the 3rd Siege Regiment across the Saracen plains. Upon arrival, the regiment constructed a forward station merely 200 kilometers from the heretic positions. From here, soldiers would be dispatched to the front. Locomotives continuously delivered new death corps, while work teams laboured on expanding the main branch and building intermediate stations for the storage of fuel, food, and other military supplies. A massive rear base for supporting the Krieg divisions was established. The campaign plan. The plan of the 88th Siege Army for demolishing the defensive lines of Vraks and the subsequent reclamation of the citadel included multiple offensives on 2 fronts. Instead of attacking in one direction and giving the enemy a chance to concentrate their forces on that section, the Imperial Command decided to encircle Vraks and disperse the pressure of the line corps across all fronts. The approaches to the citadel were determined by the terrain. From the south and east, the territory was intersected by deep gorges and canyons, posing an insurmountable barrier for any infantry army. When the ancestors of the first colonists on Vraks planned the construction of the citadel, they chose a suitable location. The strike would have to be delivered from the west or north, where the main defensive fortifications were concentrated. The northern group of forces would be formed by the 1st and 30th Line Corps, while the 12th and 34th would form the southern group, occupying the territory from the Saracen Abyss to Sector 45. These 2 corps were instructed to breach the outer western line of defence. The 1st Line Corps was to attack the northern fortifications by bypassing the western ones. Ideally, this would allow the Imperials to advance eastward, bypassing the northern defensive line, the construction of which was never completed, and strike directly at the second line between sectors 57-63. Undoubtedly, exemplary coordination of actions was required from all corps to avoid the stretching of fronts, detachment of units from supply lines, and enemy counterattacks. Each foothold had to be captured systematically and with utmost caution. Furthermore, the doctrines of Krieg did not involve deep penetration into enemy positions without flank support. After the fall of the outer fortifications, encirclement could commence. As the regiments approached the second line of defence, the overall length of the front would sharply decrease, thus reducing the danger of enemy counteroffensives. For this reason, the first line of fortifications had to be seized as quickly as possible at any cost. At the second line, regiment commanders could allow themselves to be more cautious and probe the enemy defences for vulnerable sectors before the decisive advance. After the destruction of the second line of fortifications, the ring around the citadel of Vraks would tighten once again, now fully completing the encirclement of the fortress and driving the rebels back to the inner defence lines. Then, for the first time since the beginning of the war, the citadel would come within range of the Imperials' long-range artillery. By that moment, the insurgents would realise the inevitability of their defeat. All that would remain for the 88th Siege Army was to wait. There would be no escape for the rebels from the deadly hail of Krieg shells. Beginning. The official start time of the Siege of Vraks is recorded in the archives of the Imperium. As the first dawn rays touched the Van Meersland wastes, the sentries at the outposts of Vraks' outer defence line surveyed the cold, dusty landscape with sleepy eyes. Simultaneously, miles to the west, through rangefinders and scanners, many eyes were focused on the positions of the rebels, awaiting the order to open fire. Gun crews stood by their cannons in full combat readiness. The heavy barrels of the Earthshakers were raised to the heavens in a grim greeting to the new dawn. Behind them lay the shells prepared for prolonged bombardment. Battery commanders checked the fuses of the shells and awaited the code words over Vox. Suddenly, the transmitters came to life, erupting with interference and a series of piercing signals. The operator quickly flipped the switches, and the Vox transmitter decoded the incoming message. Turning to the waiting commander nearby, the Vox operator confirmed, "Signal confirmed, sir. Open fire." The commanding officer turned and raised his hand. The artillerymen and gun crews took their positions as the integrated communication systems in their helmets transmitted the received order. The commander's hand dropped. Fire. An unknown scribe archivist of the Administratum noted that the siege of Vraks began in the year 813 of the 41st millennium. 15 kilometers from the imperial positions, the shells landed with a thunderous crash, hurling shards of stone mixed with grey dust into the sky and blanketing everything around with scorching shrapnel. The crescendo of explosions intensified, building in tempo as the Krieg gunners relished their task. The roar of the Earthshakers overpowered the wail of heavy bombards, which were almost vertically raining shells down on the rebels, creating colossal craters in the loose earth. Massive boulders were hurled skyward, falling like deadly hail only to be lifted again by a new series of blasts. The bombardment continued throughout the morning, churning the outer defence line until the barrels of the 88th Siege Army were red-hot. Meanwhile, behind the front, the rebel gunners hurried to deliver a retaliatory artillery strike. The massive basilisks thundered into their pre-prepared positions, well protected from enemy fire. Their hydraulic pistons groaned as the barrels of the machines began to rise inexorably. The breeches swung open, awaiting the loading of shells. The final check of the range to the target, vertical and horizontal adjustments, and the basilisks opened fire, straining their shock absorbers, which tried to mitigate the colossal recoil of the 40-ton machine. The artillery duel had begun. Far along the Krieg gun lines, the sound of incoming shells was impossible to hear over the deafening roar of their own salvos. Death Corps gunners moved and loaded ammunition when suddenly enemy shells began to burst among them. The first enemy salvo landed with a significant shortfall, then overshot, and then began to dangerously approach the Krieg positions. Battery 413 took a direct hit, shredding an Earthshaker like a child's toy and incinerating 8 crew members after the stacked ammunition detonated. It was a lucky shot from the maximum possible range of the enemy's guns, but it showed that the forthcoming duel would not be a one-sided slaughter. As the artillerymen exchanged fire, soldiers of the 158th Regiment, clad in dark long coats and with gas masks on their grim faces, marched in ranks toward the enemy positions, maintaining a 5-yard distance. Shells screamed overhead, racing toward their targets. In the heat of the fierce exchange, the artillerymen almost forgot about the infantry marching across the battlefield. According to orders, today's infantry actions were to be limited to a steady advance towards the enemy and stopping to establish a forward line of trenches. No attacks on enemy positions were planned, as the artillery needed much more time to properly break down enemy fortifications than just a morning, and the bombardment served only as cover, shielding the guardsmen from sudden attacks by rebel infantry and wearing down enemy batteries. By sunset, the first individual foxholes, each accommodating 2 men and 6 feet deep, were to be dug. The following day, the foxholes were to be expanded and connected with narrow passages. Thus, each squad will construct its primary line of trenches, which will be expanded to a platoon trench and then a company trench, which in turn will connect with the neighbouring ones. The task was planned to be executed over several days. These manually dug first trenches, approximately 6 feet deep and 2 feet wide, would become the foundation for permanent fortifications. From the relative safety of the trenches, it was already possible to expand the trench, fill and lay sandbags. Under the cover of darkness, the guardsmen stretched wire entanglements to prevent sudden attacks from enemy patrols and squads. Heavy weaponry was placed in hastily constructed dugouts. The rudiments of bunkers began to emerge in the walls of the trenches. Platoons took turns on duty. While 2 squads stood guard, 2 others dug the trench and 2 more rested from work. All aspects were meticulously planned and purposeful. These actions fully conformed to the rigorous training of the Death Corps of Krieg. With entrenching tools, spades and picks, the guardsmen transformed the landscape of their new home. Platoons and companies competed in the speed of constructing fortifications, as if cadet units during preparation on Krieg. The pumice-like stones of Vraks crumbled easily, so the trenches quickly expanded. It was dirty work, turning men into semblances of grey phantoms. And although with each passing thunderstorm the trenches turned into a continuous muddy quagmire, the construction of the primary defensive networks was successfully completed within a week. Now work could begin on laying communication lines to the rear positions and building saps towards the enemy for creating forward outposts from which they could harass the enemy and gain early warnings of rebel actions. Despite the methodical fortification of the Death Corps on the positions, the enemy did not launch counterattacks. Driven by relentless bombardment into secure shelters, the insurgents could only oppose the Imperials with sniper and occasional mortar fire. Thus, 2 parallel lines of defense appeared, staring at each other across the vacuum of no man's land into which neither side dared to venture. While the Death Corps erected and fortified trenches, the Xaphan army occupied already prepared defensive positions. Although they were referred to as lines of defense on maps, in reality no single line existed. Each was more of a defensive area, where trenches with low fortified ferroconcrete and plascrete walls connected firing positions. These were heavy bunkers with numerous firing positions, fortifications of sandbags and improvised barricades. Deep into the ground dug shelters for personnel from artillery fire. Naturally, all positions were defended by miles of anti-tank barriers, barbed wire and minefields. Since the uprising, the rebels have relayed millions of mines, making the pre-war Imperial intelligence data on hazardous areas less reliable. In places where defensive positions converged into strong points, the defensive screens could withstand even the most powerful artillery barrage. Typically, these structures provided defenders with intersecting fields of fire for mutual support. Overall, each such line of defense could reach depths of up to 5 miles. The destruction of each of them would be a significant endeavour, and any offensive would inevitably result in substantial losses for the Loyalists. To further complicate the Imperial task, the lines of defence around the citadel gradually became denser and more formidable. The first assault on the outer fortifications. Each line of fortifications had to be breached sequentially, and postponing this bloody work was akin to death. The first offensive needed to commence soon if command planned to conduct the campaign according to schedule. For the first assault in Sector 46, 39, the 149th Regiment was selected. According to intelligence from pre-war sources, the area seemed suitable for attack. Construction work on the fortifications was not yet completed, and this sector had a decent chance to organize the long-desired breakthrough. Directly from the right and left flanks, the 149th Regiment would be supported by powerful attacks from the 143rd and 150th Regiments, whose goal was to engage the enemy's reserves in battle and draw enemy forces away from the direction of the main strike. Behind the 149th Regiment, in the first combat readiness, the units of the 11th Assault Corps would await. In the event of successful operation development and a breach in the enemy's defences, the Assault Corps' tanks would have the opportunity to deliver a swift strike deep into the rear of the rebels. In the year 813 of the 41st millennium, preparations began for the first infantry assault. 500,000 guardsmen would surge towards the enemy positions, wave after wave over 2 days. The first wave was not expected to achieve any significant progress. Its attack aimed to identify weak spots in the enemy's defences. The second wave, led by grenadier units, would deliver coordinated strikes on these vulnerable spots, consolidate and hold positions until the second day when the third wave arrives to widen the breach in the rebel defences. Following this, the 61st Tank Regiment, released from reserve, would move into the created passage. Naturally, the attack would be preceded by days of intensive bombardment in Sector 46, 39 and adjacent areas. The preparations for the first assault were going well. A significant number of guns from the bombardment corps and infantry companies arrived at the designated positions under continuous mortar and artillery fire from the enemy. The artillery's tasks in the upcoming battle were exceedingly complex. In the forward trenches, the Guards' mortars would be positioned to shell enemy trenches and cover the infantry as it leaves their cover. Behind them, in the second line of trenches, were quad-gun emplacements and heavy mortars. They would suppress the enemy's discovered firing positions. Further behind were positioned the Medusa siege guns to destroy the bunkers and dugouts of the renegades. Further on, the mighty Earthshakers were deployed, whose barrage would force the infantry of the renegades into cover. These guns would later join in destroying the enemy batteries. Concluding the ranks of the Imperial artillery were the bombards. These monstrous machines would add their colossal firepower to the salvos of the Earthshakers and help rout the most fortified positions of the insurgents. Over 4 million shells had been prepared for the offensive as the most powerful artillery bombardment since the landing on Vraks was expected, concentrated on 3 sectors. The guns of the 21st Bombardment Corps fired a salvo, supporting the artillery companies of the siege regiments. Thus began the first 5 days of artillery preparation ahead of the coming offensive. The guns mercilessly turned the no-man's land and the forward positions of the renegades into a morass of mud and craters. From the trenches it seemed that nothing could survive such a bombardment. The artillery destroyed everything. Anti-tank obstacles, barbed wire, bunkers, roads through which reinforcements and supplies could arrive. It was a devastating demonstration of firepower, and it maintained its pace day after day. With nightmarish monotony, shells continued to rain from the sky, and it seemed as though the advancing guardsmen would have no one left to fight. In the year 813 of the 41st millennium, the first attacking companies were densely packed into the trench along the entire front line. Only a trench wall and an assault ladder separated them from no man's land. Last night, under the cover of darkness, teams of sappers had made breaches in the remaining wire barriers. Squad commanders awaited the order to advance. Platoon leaders awaited orders from their commanders, and sergeants awaited orders from the platoon leaders. Meanwhile, the bombardment intensified, reaching its peak when explosions followed one another so rapidly that the roaring turned into a continuous wall of noise that did not cease for a moment. And then everything fell silent. An eerie silence suddenly fell over the battlefield as the guns fell silent precisely on schedule. Through the Vox network, the order was given to commence the attack, and the first detachments of the Death Corps rushed to the assault ladders. One after another, men crawled onto the parapet, weaving through their own barbed wire, forming into lines. Then the dark, hunched figures moved directly across the crater-scarred no-man's land. After the bombardment ended, the soldiers of the insurgents hurried to occupy the surviving defensive positions. Their fortifications had turned to ruins, the walls reduced to dust at best, trenches in places resembling mass graves, and bunkers destroyed by direct hits, burying entire detachments. However, despite the wild fury of the artillery barrage, many renegades survived by hiding in underground shelters. And now, as the overseers and officers shouted orders, they rushed to their positions. The Death Corps was approaching, and the rebels had to fight for their skins to the last drop of blood. 10 yards, 20. The infantry advanced unhindered, and then the weapons roared. The shells of the heavy bolters whizzed over no man's land and tore into the ranks of the guardsmen, but the Death Corps continued to move forward, unwavering and determined, the first ranks marching in parade formation. And so they perished, soldier after soldier, cut down by the hurricane fire from the rebels' bunkers, yet nevertheless inexorably advancing toward the enemy. At that moment, The enemy artillery joined the battle. The guns were well sighted, thus the fire was precise and deadly. Suddenly, no man's land was covered with blossoming buds of explosions, erupting fountains of earth amidst the marching guardsmen. In the thickened air from the smoke and dust, the bodies of Krieg soldiers were tossed into the air like rag dolls after the accurate hits of artillery shells. But even this could not break the advancing line of the Death Corps, steadily marching into the heart of the fiery storm. Within the first minutes, thousands perished on no man's land. Sometimes entire lines were swept away completely by the fire of the rebels. As the intensity of the enemy bombardment increased, some squads lay down taking cover in craters, but the enemy artillery immediately began to strike them. Officers tried to rally the platoons to attack, but only perished in fruitless attempts. In the trenches of the Imperials, new infantry units fixed bayonets and awaited their turn to be sent into the meat grinder. They did not have to wait long, and they charged when the enemy had already returned to their defensive positions. Many met death immediately upon exiting the trenches, the force of the impact often throwing guardsmen back onto their comrades who had not yet climbed the assault ladders. Few managed to run more than a dozen yards from the parapet before the barrage forced them to lie down. The battle was ruthless and bloody. Whole platoons were mowed down by the intense enemy fire. No man's land was strewn with corpses mixed with writhing wounded. Survivors crawled through the mire, some trying to return to their trenches, others stubbornly pushing forward. A few squads managed to reach the enemy defence line, launching bayonet charges and throwing grenades over the defensive wall. But even here they were met by an enemy, fighting on their positions with the desperation of the doomed. In Sector 469, 391, not a single platoon managed to reach the rebel fortifications. Of the 9 platoons of the 32nd Company, initially numbering around 600 men, 542 were counted as killed and wounded in the first wave of attackers, including all officers. 58 survivors, answering the evening roll call, were not enough to form even a single full-strength platoon. Despite the unfolding carnage, a second wave was preparing to advance behind the first line of trenches. Amidst the throngs of infantrymen stood the grenadiers, hunched under the weight of their armour. The salvos of the batteries targeted distant objectives, providing little aid to the guardsmen marching towards certain death. Such was the life of the soldiers of the Death Corps. The second wave would have to advance in the same vein as the first. At the signal, they climbed over the parapet. A fiery vortex engulfed the guardsmen, whose torn bodies joined their fallen comrades from the first wave. In the passages cut through the barbed wire thickets, grotesque, bloody heaps of corpses rose. The slaughter continued throughout the day until, at sunset, the order to halt the advance was given. All night, the wounded crawled through the hellish landscape, occasionally illuminated by a signal flare, back to their own ranks. No man's land seemed alive due to the mass of writhing figures. Some, even at death's door, held their positions until sunrise, fortified in craters. Occasionally, isolated skirmishes flared up in the darkness as groups of brave souls attempted to reach enemy positions. In light of the insignificant gains, the losses were nightmarish, and at dawn it would continue. The endless artillery duel resumed, and shells once more tore through bodies in fiery bursts. The third wave went on the attack and paid the same bloody price as the first two. The achievements proved just as negligible. The desired breakthrough did not occur. Contrary to received intelligence, the construction of defensive lines was completed on schedule. Furthermore, the fortifications had been strengthened, which allowed the insurgents to withstand the assault. In the year 813 of the 41st millennium, as remnants of the Krieg units returned to the trenches, the insurgents counterattacked, hoping to capitalize on their victory and the heavy losses suffered by the Imperials. It was the rebels' turn to cross no man's land in their chimeras. They forewent preliminary bombardment to avoid warning the Loyalists. The battered Kriegs took up positions at machine gun nests and in bunkers, undamaged from the failed advance. Across the front line, the counterattack faltered, and the quad heavy mortar emplacements on the second line swiftly adjusted their fire and subdued the enemy. In Trench R 462 3892, before Lieutenant Marrow and his squad of surviving guardsmen, drawn from 3 destroyed platoons of the 15th Company, 143rd Regiment, a mass of insurgent infantry became clearly discernible from the observation posts, crossing no man's land. A message was sent to the gunners via Vraks, but no artillery support followed. Despite the intense fire from laser guns and heavy stubbers, the rebels relentlessly approached. Marrow lost contact with the units on his flanks. The enemy was already close, showering the trenches with grenades. His men responded in kind. In the fierce skirmish, the lieutenant's platoon was simply overwhelmed due to numerical superiority. First he was left with 30 men, then 20. Rebel soldiers were already leaping into the Loyalists' trenches, and Marrow had no choice but to engage in a desperate melee. A sudden strike of the chainsword severed the lieutenant's left arm, and as he fell with a mortal wound, the trench was captured. The enemy attempted to storm the second section of the defensive line, but encountered 2 stubborn resistance. Later, when the counter-offensive was stopped, following a new request, the Earthshakers incinerated the enemy-occupied Imperial positions. By sunset, the counter-offensive had faltered, and the bodies of the rebels layered over the fallen soldiers of Krieg. The opposing forces returned to a state of positional warfare. The duel of the gunners continued, but the ferocity of the 3-day battle subsided. Life in the trenches. Along the entire length of the front, both warring sides were actively entrenching. The Krieg's trench lines expanded into the rear, a 3rd and 4th line were added, firing points were reinforced, and forward positions significantly strengthened. Gradually, a network of trenches enveloped the Van Mersland wastes. It seemed neither side intended to undertake active operations in the near future. The premature assault by the 143rd Regiment became only the first of countless similar attacks undertaken thereafter. Each regiment would partake in crossing no man's land, and practically each would be repelled. During the 34th Corps offensive on the Saritam Heights, the 308th Regiment managed to secure Hill 204 and valiantly held their positions. The Guardsmen fought for weeks, until repeated enemy counterattacks forced them to retreat. For weeks, the stalemate kept both warring sides tense. But despite the difficult situation, each unit was required to carry out patrol duties and participate in raids on enemy positions. Night operations in no man's land included intercepting patrols, setting up minefields, and searching for suitable passages through thorny brush. Trench raids to capture prisoners were commonplace. Prisoners would usually confess enemy numbers, their locations, and artillery positions. Artillery engaged in incessant barrages, wearing down the enemy's rear so that death could strike the soldiers most unexpectedly. Even during lulls, when neither side engaged in offensives, casualty lists continued to rapidly grow. Without active hostilities, the 88th Siege Army lost an average of about 2,000 men a day. Undoubtedly, losses were pre-planned, and reinforcements for the Death Corps arrived according to schedule. Life in the trenches forced the Guardsmen to resemble rats, packed together in damp underground shelters. Sentries in the trenches vigilantly scanned for any signs of the enemy. Daily rains and other manifestations of Vraks's fickle climate turned the trenches into flowing streams and no man's land into a continuous quagmire. After some time, the water receded, leaving behind a viscous, grey, muddy mire. Troops arriving at the front line felt as if they had been thrown into a huge furnace, burning unceasingly day and night. Over the Van Merland wastelands rolled the unceasing roar of artillery salvos and bursting shells. At night, the sky blazed with flares and explosions. As one approached the front line, the number of craters increased, and more corpses lay in the mud with abandoned equipment. Amidst the dead, quartermasters with their aides skulked, stripping the corpses of uniforms, weapons, ammunition, and equipment. All of this would be sent to the rear depots and redistributed among the newcomers. What did a single body mean to these grim figures? A chance to augment the supply lists with gear far more valuable than easily replaceable flesh. Vraks was a monotonous, gloomy wasteland, grey and black, shrouded in a pall of smog that blocked out the sunlight. The air was laden with the stench of decay. In places of failed assaults, unburied dead lay everywhere, as attempts to gather the fallen under constant shelling only led to further losses. Day by day, artillery ground the bodies with its fire until the slain soldiers were dismembered several times over. No man's land was strewn with the decaying fragments of bodies that once were human. Soon, both warring sides began stacking the skulls and bones of the fallen in their trenches, forming gruesome chapels in honor of the bravery and sacrifice of their comrades in arms. They were surrounded by death. As the months of futile standoff dragged on, the air and the very earth became suffused with a pernicious contagion. Thus passed the first year of the siege. The outer defensive line withstood the initial assaults, and the warring sides contented themselves with mutually wearing each other down. Eventually, something, somewhere, would give. But until that time, the armies remained embroiled in the grindstone of slow, mutual annihilation. To be continued